The city of Gloucester, situated in the southwest of England, is a place steeped in profound history. Its ancient Roman foundations and majestic 11th century cathedral speak to a legacy of endurance, community, and quiet provincial life. For decades, the residents of this cathedral city went about their daily routines, walking along its historic streets, completely unaware that behind the unremarkable facade of a terraced house, one of the most complex and devastating criminal cases in modern British history was slowly unfolding. This is the story of a meticulous, groundbreaking police investigation. It is a testament to the relentless pursuit of truth by forensic scientists, detectives, and legal professionals who worked tirelessly to dismantle a decades-long conspiracy of silence. It is also a solemn remembrance of the victims, young women and children whose lives were tragically cut short and whose eventual discovery permanently altered the landscape of law enforcement, child protection, and the community they left behind. To understand the scope of the investigation, it is necessary to examine the social context of the 1970s and 1980s. This era was characterized by significant societal shifts in the United Kingdom. It was a time before the advent of ubiquitous closed-circuit television, mobile tracking, or digitized national missing persons databases. Hitchhiking was a common and socially acceptable mode of transportation for young people. University students, young professionals, and teenagers seeking independence frequently traveled across the country with minimal oversight. It was within this transient culture that vulnerable individuals could easily slip through the cracks of society. When young women vanished during this period, their disappearances were often tragically miscategorized. Law enforcement agencies, operating without the benefit of interconnected communication networks, frequently assumed these individuals had simply run away to start new lives in London or other major cities. This systemic blind spot created an environment where predatory individuals could operate with an alarming degree of impunity. Fred West and his wife Rosemary presented a carefully constructed facade to the outside world. To the casual observer in Gloucester, Fred was a local self-employed builder, often seen driving his van, offering handyman services, and engaging in jovial, superficial conversations with neighbors. Rosemary was seen as a busy mother, managing a large, chaotic household. Their residence on Cromwell Street was a large, rambling property that they frequently rented out to lodgers. This constant influx of tenants provided a convenient cover for the transient presence of young women in their home. However, beneath this veneer of working-class normality lay a deeply disturbed psychological partnership. Criminologists and forensic psychologists would later classify their dynamic as a rare and incredibly dangerous convergence of pathologies. Together, they formed a closed system of enabling behavior, a folie deux, where their darkest impulses were not only tolerated, but actively encouraged by one another. This partnership allowed them to systematically exploit, harm, and ultimately end the lives of those who entered their sphere of influence, all while maintaining the outward appearance of a bustling, albeit eccentric, family. The catalyst that would eventually unravel their decades of concealment did not come from a stranger, but from within their own family. Heather West, the eldest daughter of Fred and Rosemary, was last seen in 1987. She was just 16 years old. For years, her parents maintained a consistent, fabricated narrative regarding her whereabouts. They told neighbors, family members, and inquiring authorities that Heather had moved away, that she was working in a holiday camp, or that she had relocated to London with a romantic partner. Because Heather was legally old enough to leave home, and because the family environment was known to be turbulent, this explanation was initially accepted. However, as the years passed without any contact, a profound sense of unease began to grow among those who knew her. Heather had left behind her bank accounts, her personal belongings, and her friends. The inconsistencies in her parents' stories became increasingly apparent. It was the persistent doubts of her siblings and the quiet, persistent inquiries of social workers that eventually prompted the Gloucestershire Constabulary to take a closer, more critical look at the West household in the early 1990s. Detective Superintendent John Bennett was appointed to lead what would become one of the most harrowing and logistically challenging investigations in the history of British policing. The initial phase of the inquiry was a masterclass in patient, strategic detective work. The police could not simply storm the property without substantial evidence. They began by meticulously reconstructing Heather West's life leading up to her disappearance. Detectives interviewed former teachers, friends, and extended family members, building a comprehensive timeline that highlighted the absolute cessation of her existence in 1987. They cross-referenced employment records, national insurance contributions, and medical registries, confirming that Heather had not interacted with any state or private institution since she vanished. Armed with this circumstantial but compelling evidence, the police secured a search warrant for the Cromwell Street property in February 1994. The objective was clear but daunting: to find evidence of Heather West and to determine once and for all if her parents were responsible for her disappearance. When law enforcement arrived at the property, they were faced with an immediate and immense logistical challenge. The house was a cluttered, structurally complex building that had been subjected to numerous amateur renovations by Fred West over the years. The initial search focused on the rear garden. Fred West had previously boasted to neighbors about his deep excavations and concrete work in the yard. Detectives, drawing upon their knowledge of concealment techniques, recognized this as a critical area of interest. However, standard digging could easily destroy vital forensic evidence. The police required specialized assistance. They called upon forensic archaeologists, experts trained in the delicate recovery of historical artifacts, to apply their methodologies to a modern crime scene. The excavation of the garden was conducted with painstaking precision. The area was divided into a rigid grid system, allowing every square inch of soil to be mapped, sifted, and recorded. The process was slow and laborious, hindered by the cold February weather and the dense, compacted nature of the earth. Officers used trowels and small brushes, treating the garden not as a construction site, but as a fragile repository of truth. It was during this methodical process that the first tragic discovery was made. The remains of Heather West were located, carefully concealed beneath the earth. This discovery immediately escalated the missing persons inquiry into a formal murder investigation. Fred and Rosemary West were taken into custody. The discovery of Heather was only the beginning. As the forensic archaeologists continued their work, the true, horrifying scale of the crimes began to emerge. Additional remains were discovered in the garden. It became chillingly apparent that the property was a clandestine burial site. The investigation team was suddenly faced with a crisis of identification. Who were these additional victims? To answer this, the police brought in forensic anthropologists and forensic odontologists. Forensic anthropology is the application of the science of physical anthropology and human osteology in a legal setting. These experts are trained to read the silent language of bone. When remains are discovered, especially those that have been concealed for many years, traditional methods of identification, such as visual recognition or fingerprinting, are impossible. The anthropologists meticulously examine the recovered skeletal remains to determine the biological profile of each victim. By measuring the length of the long bones, examining the fusion of the cranial sutures, and analyzing the structure of the pelvis, they could accurately estimate the age, sex, and stature of the individuals. Furthermore, these experts looked for evidence of trauma. They documented clinical signs of structural damage to the bones, identifying fractures and other anomalies that provided vital clues about the circumstances surrounding the fatal injuries sustained by the victims. Equally crucial was the work of the forensic odontologists. Dental enamel is the hardest substance in the human body, and teeth often survive long after other tissues have degraded. The odontologist took detailed X-rays of the victim's teeth, noting fillings, extractions, and unique dental anomalies. Detectives then faced the monumental task of cross-referencing these dental profiles with the records of hundreds of missing persons from across the country. They visited dental practices, retrieved decades-old paper files, and slowly, name by name, restored the identities of the victims. Through this rigorous scientific process, The tragic roster was compiled. Young women who had vanished in the 1970s, students waiting at bus stops, lodgers who had rented rooms at the house. Their final resting places had finally been found. As the death toll rose, the structural integrity of the house itself became a severe impediment to the investigation. Fred West had buried victims not just in the garden, but beneath the very foundations of the property, including the cellar and the bathroom. To access these areas without causing the building to collapse, the police had to employ structural engineers. Massive steel supports were brought in to shore up the walls and ceilings. The house was essentially suspended in place while investigators dug beneath it. To locate anomalies beneath the concrete without randomly destroying the floors, the investigative team utilized ground-penetrating radar. This technology, relatively novel in criminal investigations at the time, involves transmitting high-frequency radio waves into the ground. When the waves encounter a boundary between different materials, such as solid soil and a buried object or a void, the signal is reflected back to a receiving antenna. By analyzing these returning signals, technicians could map the subsurface environment, identifying areas of disturbed earth or concrete that warranted physical excavation. This targeted approach saved invaluable time and ensured that the structural modifications made by the perpetrator were systematically dismantled to reveal the evidence hidden within. While the forensic teams were systematically deconstructing the physical property, a parallel psychological deconstruction was taking place in the police interview rooms. The interrogation of Fred and Rosemary West presented a stark study in contrasting criminal behaviors. Fred West adopted a strategy of partial admission and manipulation. He initially denied any involvement, but as the forensic evidence became insurmountable, he began to confess to certain crimes while adamantly denying others. He frequently changed his narrative, attempting to cast himself as a sole actor in an effort to shield his wife from prosecution. His interviews were characterized by a disturbing joviality and a detachment from the gravity of his actions. He provided detectives with detailed accounts of his movements and the structural work he had done to conceal the evidence, yet he consistently minimized the psychological and physical torment inflicted upon the victims. Rosemary West, conversely, maintained a stance of absolute, unwavering denial. Throughout hours of intense questioning, she presented herself as an oblivious housewife, completely ignorant of the atrocities that had occurred within the walls of her own home. She claimed she rarely ventured into the cellar or the garden and knew nothing of the young women who had vanished after crossing their threshold. Her demeanor was combative, defensive, and deeply resistant to the subtle psychological pressures applied by the seasoned detectives. The investigative team knew that breaking her facade would require an overwhelming accumulation of circumstantial and forensic evidence, as she was determined not to offer a single incriminatory statement. The trajectory of the legal proceedings was abruptly altered on New Year's Day, 1995. Fred West, while being held on remand at Winson Green Prison, took his own life. This event sent shockwaves through the investigation. With the primary confessor dead, the prosecution faced an immense hurdle. They now had to try Rosemary West alone. The challenge was formidable. How does a prosecution team prove that a woman was deeply involved in multiple homicides when the physical acts of concealment were primarily attributed to her builder husband, and when she maintained absolute silence regarding her complicity? The responsibility of building this complex case fell to the Crown Prosecution Service, led by Queen's Counsel Brian Levison. The legal strategy hinged on the concept of joint enterprise. In British law, joint enterprise dictates that if two or more people agree to commit a crime, they can all be held equally responsible for its outcome, regardless of who physically struck the fatal blow. The prosecution had to construct a timeline and a web of circumstantial evidence so tight that it left no room for reasonable doubt regarding Rosemary's active participation. The trial of Rosemary West commenced in October 1995 at Winchester Crown Court. It was one of the most heavily scrutinized legal proceedings in British history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal professionals, and the grieving families of the victims. Security was unprecedented. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, charged with the collective trauma of the revelations that had unfolded over the previous year. Brian Levison opened the prosecution's case by meticulously dismantling Rosemary's defense of ignorance. He guided the jury through the architectural realities of the Cromwell Street property. The house was not a sprawling mansion. It was a confined, intimately shared space. The prosecution argued that it was scientifically and logically impossible for extensive excavations, the pouring of concrete, and the prolonged presence of captive individuals to occur without the active knowledge and participation of the matriarch of the household. The prosecution presented compelling forensic evidence linking Rosemary directly to the environment of the crimes. They detailed the recovery of personal items belonging to the victims that had been absorbed into the household inventory. Furthermore, the prosecution called upon surviving witnesses who had resided in the house or interacted with the couple. These testimonies painted a chilling portrait of Rosemary West. Witnesses described her not as a passive, subservient wife, but as a dominant, highly aggressive individual who wielded significant control over the household dynamics. They detailed instances of severe behavioral volatility and her active participation in the psychological manipulation of those around her. The prosecution also heavily relied on the timeline of the disappearances. They demonstrated that several of the victims had vanished during periods when Fred West was incarcerated for minor offenses. This crucial piece of circumstantial evidence strongly indicated that Rosemary was not only capable of operating independently, but was the primary instigator in specific instances. The systematic nature of the crimes, the consistent methodology of acquiring lodgers, and the subsequent financial exploitation of the victims' belongings all pointed toward a coordinated, shared enterprise. The defense, led by Richard Ferguson, faced an uphill battle. Their strategy relied on portraying Fred West as a monolithic, controlling monster who had completely subjugated his wife. They argued that Rosemary was a victim of his psychological dominance, too terrified to question his actions and genuinely oblivious to the extent of his criminality. The defense highlighted the lack of definitive forensic evidence directly placing the murder weapons in Rosemary's hands. They urged the jury not to convict based on association or proximity, but to demand absolute proof of her active participation in the fatal events. However, the sheer weight of the circumstantial evidence, combined with the chilling inconsistencies in Rosemary's own police interviews, proved insurmountable. After a grueling trial that lasted several weeks, the judge delivered his final instructions to the jury. He reminded them of their duty to weigh the evidence dispassionately, to set aside the inherent emotional horror of the crimes, and to focus strictly on the legal definitions of complicity and joint enterprise. The jury deliberated meticulously. When they returned to the courtroom, the silence was absolute. The foreman read the verdicts. Rosemary West was found guilty on 10 counts of murder. The courtroom, filled with the families who had waited decades for answers, exhaled a collective breath of somber vindication. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke with grave authority. He highlighted the systematic, calculating nature of the crimes and the profound betrayal of trust involved, particularly regarding her own family members. Rosemary West was sentenced to life imprisonment. The Home Secretary later imposed a whole life tariff, ensuring that she would never be eligible for parole, a rare and severe penalty reserved for the most dangerous offenders in the British penal system. The conclusion of the legal proceedings did not mark the end of the story for the city of Gloucester. The community was left to grapple with a profound sense of shock and betrayal. How had such darkness existed in their midst for so long? The physical manifestation of this trauma was the house itself. 25 Cromwell Street had become an object of morbid fascination, drawing crowds of onlookers and dark tourists. The presence of the building was a constant, painful reminder to the victims' families and the local residents. In a decisive and unprecedented move, the local government, in consultation with the families and the police, purchased the property. In 1996, the house was systematically dismantled. The demolition was total. Not only were the bricks and mortar removed, but the very foundations were excavated and destroyed. The earth was cleared, and the site was transformed into a landscaped public walkway. This act of architectural erasure was deeply symbolic. It was a conscious decision by the community to reclaim their space, to refuse to allow a monument to cruelty to stand, and to replace a site of profound trauma with a path of quiet reflection. The legacy of this investigation extended far beyond the borders of Gloucester. The systemic failures that had allowed the perpetrators to operate for so long prompted a massive overhaul of British law enforcement protocols. The most significant change was the establishment of more robust, interconnected systems for tracking missing persons. The realization that police forces across different counties were not effectively sharing information led to the development of national databases. Law enforcement agencies were mandated to treat the disappearance of vulnerable individuals, particularly young women and teenagers, with immediate and serious attention rather than dismissing them as runaways. Furthermore, the case sparked a national conversation about child protection and the role of social services. The fact that young children within the household had suffered for years without definitive intervention highlighted severe flaws in the safety nets designed to protect the most vulnerable. This led to legislative changes aimed at improving communication between schools, social workers, and the police, ensuring that signs of domestic abuse and neglect are identified and acted upon with greater urgency. The forensic methodologies pioneered during the excavation also set a new standard for historical investigations. The successful integration of structural engineering, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic anthropology demonstrated the incredible potential of multidisciplinary approaches in solving complex crimes. The techniques refined in the Garden of Cromwell Street are now standard practice in the investigation of clandestine graves worldwide, bringing closure to countless families who might otherwise have been left in perpetual uncertainty. As we reflect on the monumental efforts of the detectives, the precision of the forensic scientists, and the unwavering dedication of the legal professionals, we must ultimately return our focus to the victims. They were students with bright futures, young mothers seeking independence, and children who deserved safety within their own homes. Their lives were unjustly taken, but their eventual discovery brought a harsh light to the shadowed corners of society. The investigation into this case remains a defining moment in criminal justice, a solemn reminder of the lengths to which law enforcement must go to uncover the truth. It stands as a testament to the fact that, no matter how deep secrets are buried, the relentless pursuit of justice can bring them to the surface. As we consider the profound changes implemented in the wake of this tragedy, we must ask ourselves, are the systems we have in place today truly sufficient to protect the vulnerable, or does the safety of our communities still rely too heavily on the vigilance of the people next door?